No, good morning, Mr Dunlop.
Good morning, my lord. The first witness this morning is Ms Wallace of Victim Support Scotland. For the benefit of the notes and the recording, the witness number is PSR 0085.
Okay, good. Good morning, Ms Wallace.
Good morning.
Now, Mr Dunlop will ask you some questions. Mr Dunlop,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Ms Wallace. I wonder if you can provide the inquiry with your full name, please.
Yes, it's Stephanie Kate Wallace.
And I think we won't be addressing you by, but I think your preferred name is Kate, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you're here today representing Victim Support Scotland. What position or what role do you have within that organisation?
I'm the Chief Executive.
And as the Chief Executive, can you explain what your roles or your responsibilities are?
I've got overall responsibility for the operations, I suppose strategic direction and risk management of the whole organisation.
And how long have you been in that particular role?
Since October 2017.
And before that, were you within another role within the same organisation?
I was a Chief Executive of an organisation called Visualise, a third sector charity providing support for disabled people.
Okay. And in terms of Victim Support Scotland, which I might refer to as VSS, if that's okay, what particular services does it offer within Scotland?
So, three main services. We provide support to victims who are referred to us or who come to us ourselves looking for emotional and practical support, being a victim of any type of crime, and we support them through the community. We also have a service based in courts, so we're co-located in all high courts and sheriff courts across Scotland, and we receive referrals from the Crown Office to provide support to vulnerable witnesses. We have a national helpline and live chat, and the other service that we've got is a national service providing specialist support to families bereaved by murder and culpable homicide.
And I think as we get on within your statement, sorry, I should have said you provided a statement to the inquiry, and we have that in front of us. And in terms of you've referred to those particular three categories, and there's other services in relation to domestic violence and rehousing, I think, as we'll come on to in due course when we look at your statement.
Yeah, we provide services to victims of any type of crime, including domestic violence and sexual crime. And
the personnel arrangements with Victim Support Scotland, is it all staff? Is it principally volunteers? Can you explain how that operates?
So for a national organisation, we're a relatively small staff team. We've usually got about 100 staff, give or take. But the delivery of our services in the main, apart from the specialist service for families bereaved by murder and culpable homicide, mostly it's volunteers that deliver that support. So at any one time we have around 200, 300, 400 volunteers. And those are the people who provide support directly to victims and witnesses.
So within, I think you said within all the sheriff courts, is that right? Within all the sheriff courts and the High Court, there's services provided by VSS. Is that volunteers then that are within the courts?
Yes, mostly volunteers in the courts. Yep.
And I don't know if you mentioned they're vulnerable witnesses. Can you just tell us what is a vulnerable witness?
So the referrals that we receive for vulnerable witnesses generally are those that are deemed vulnerable in the legislation. So that's by virtue of either characteristics that they have around age, so young witnesses or older people, or it can be to do with crime type. So for example, victims of domestic abuse, because it's domestic abuse, they're automatically deemed as a vulnerable witness. So we receive referrals, about 20,000 referrals a year from the Crown Office at the moment to provide support to these vulnerable witnesses, and we will support them before court, during court and then after court.
Okay. And I want to turn now to the effects of the pandemic, which you deal with within your statement. Well, firstly, I'll maybe deal with the staff and the volunteers. Now, you told us there was approximately 100 staff and that the volunteers could range between, I think you said, between 200 and 400. You said that the volunteers were all based in the courts, I think, or no, sorry. You said that within the courts it was all volunteers.
Mostly volunteers, yes, in the court for sure.
And the staff, what do the staff do? What's their role?
So the staff's role is to support, coordinate, recruit, train and manage the volunteers. So they'll supervise, support, they'll help they'll help allocate cases, if you like, to volunteers as well, and that's across the whole organisation. In the court work, mostly it's volunteers who provide that supporter role. So if someone needs, a vulnerable witness needs a supporter to sit with them when they're given their evidence, then that will generally speak and be a VSS supporter, and that will generally be a volunteer, unless there's another named organisation. And the staff really, I suppose, make sure there's sufficient numbers of volunteers scheduled for that day, that they know where they're going and what they're doing. They'll do a bit of a briefing at the beginning, some debriefing at the end.
Maybe so to help me understand, immediately before the pandemic, were the staff principally office-based and the volunteers principally not office-based, or am I not is that not correct?
It would have been, yeah, in simplistic terms, probably yes, but I think it would be a bit of a mixture. But yeah, in the main, you had volunteers delivering services and delivering support, and staff managing that. But yeah.
Well, maybe I want to look at the impacts on both staff and volunteers. So perhaps dealing firstly with volunteers. As a consequence of the pandemic, and we'll come on to the court's closing, but just generally as a consequence of the pandemic, did you lose more volunteers than you would normally expect? Most
definitely. During March, between March 2020 going into April 2020, we lost a significant number of volunteers, really within a really short space of time, and that was because it's mostly volunteers that are in the court. Courts were perceived as being a really unsafe environment, and because court is during the day, during the week, we have a high number of a retired population amongst our volunteering staff, with a volunteering cohort within courts. So that had a really big impact, and we really struggled to get those volunteers back. There has been a longer term impact, I would say, on volunteering from COVID, and the latest Scottish Household Survey is showing that volunteering rates in Scotland are significantly lower than they have been for a number of years. So there is a wider impact, but certainly we felt a very sharp shock right at the very beginning of the pandemic in terms of our volunteer numbers.
And when you said significant numbers, out of the 200 to 400, do you know approximately what kind of numbers you're talking about?
About, in the courts, about 75% at least volunteers left the organisation.
And how did that impact on delivering the services within the court if there's 75% less volunteers? I was under a lot of pressure at the time, because volunteers were saying that the courts weren't a safe environment, and they shouldn't be being asked to go into the courts. Many of them had other health conditions and were concerned given the age profile. I guess that's not a surprise. So I actually withdrew volunteers and our services from courts altogether a couple of days before, as it turned out, the lockdown was announced. So yeah, that was a challenge at that time for sure. Could the services have been delivered remotely?
Not in court. And not in the way that at that time there was no real, to any significant degree, remote evidence given. There was no, moving courts into different, at the beginning anyway, moving different courts into different areas. The expectation still was that people would turn up to go to court, that witnesses would be still given evidence, and therefore our role had to be being there to support them if they needed a supporter. I guess the issue as well was that when restrictions started coming in and there was less people allowed in buildings, that was all very difficult from a victim's perspective, and difficult for us to ascertain how much resource was actually needed, because there was large amounts of witnesses still being cited to turn up to court, even though technically they wouldn't have all been allowed in the building had they turned up. So resource planning, capacity planning at that time was almost impossible to do to any degree of accuracy, really. And as I say, the lockdown was announced a couple of days after I took that decision. In any case, not that I knew that at the time when I decided.
And if I understand correctly, what you're saying is if it's an in-person court hearing, the services delivered by VSS have to be in person as well. You have to be there with the person. Where evidence has been presented remotely, is it possible to deliver witness support remotely as well?
Yeah, yes.
And how's that actually done then?
So, in terms of, so CCTV evidence, but right, so you can give evidence remotely, and that is one of the special measures that vulnerable witnesses can have. But one thing to say about that is that at the time, certainly, and still probably the case just now, very often that remote evidence is given from the court still. So it's a CCTV room in court. There are remote evidence suites across the country. At that time, there wasn't that many of them. The challenge for us at the time was some of the rooms were quite small. So when the guidance came out about social distancing, it wasn't always possible to be in the room, in the CCTV room, with someone giving their evidence while maintaining that social distance. That very much varied across the country. So I think that probably answers your question about yeah, I just want to be clear though that remote evidence is not necessarily remote from the court, and it certainly wasn't at that time at the beginning of the pandemic. No,
I think you've answered the question. I think if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're saying is that even if the evidence has been taken remotely, the best service that can be given is with one of your volunteers or one of your staff being there in person with the particular person you're supporting. Is that a fair analysis?
And I think, and there wasn't at the time certainly the set up to be able to do that remotely. You know, like I guess thinking about giving somebody an iPad so that our face is there beside that, there was none of that going on at the time, and the thinking around that. And some, as I say, some of the buildings and the locations, even the remote evidence suite in Glasgow, the rooms were too small to have more than one person really in them.
I'll get on to digital exclusion, but just since you've mentioned it, is it comforting for somebody that you're representing or somebody that your organisation is representing to have something, even if it's simply a visual, you know, somebody that's there on an iPad, you know, just to know that there's somebody there listening to them on their side, so to speak?
It can be. I think, though, that one of the key roles for an in-court supporter to be there as a reassuring presence, yes, when somebody's given evidence, but the other thing that person's doing is looking out for signs of distress. So they need to be able to see the person giving evidence and be able to see the impact that is having on them. So an in-person presence with someone who's given evidence, I think, is really important for a number of different things. But so yeah.
Might I interrupt?
Of course, Mild.
It's a practical issue. If a person is giving evidence and it's impossible, and I've heard what you said, and I think that's correct, it's impossible for the person to be in the room because of the size of the room, would an iPad, for example, given to the person giving evidence be acceptable to the court? Because I hasten to give evidence. I don't want to give evidence, but I don't think I would have allowed a witness to have an electronic gadget looking at it. I don't know if that ever arose.
Yeah, it's doubtful, I would say. We have a protocol with COPFS, SCTS, Police Scotland around the support that's provided to vulnerable witnesses in court, and it's very, very tight and clear about exactly what is done and not. I suppose what I'm getting at though is there wasn't. My experience was that thinking through some different creative potential solutions, even to come to that conclusion, wasn't being done at that time, and the challenges that there were, you know, because one of the things would be, I suppose, give evidence from a completely different remote place that did have enough space, so you could have enough people. There was very little, if any, of that being done or thought about at all.
No, that's very clear. Thank you. Sorry.
No, not at all. Thank you, my lord. Safeguarding. What is safeguarding?
So in victim support world, safeguarding is where someone poses a significant risk to either themselves or someone else, a risk of harm, and we are required to notify someone else about that risk, either the police or a health professional. So that's how we define safeguarding in Victim Support Scotland.
And is that safeguarding of existing clients or service users?
Yes, it also applies to staff and volunteers.
Okay. And was the safeguarding function of VSS, was that impacted by the pandemic?
In terms of volume, most certainly yes. We've got a very robust safeguarding policy, as you can imagine, training for everybody across the organisation, so everybody's clear. We monitor safeguarding incidents and review action that's been taken on a weekly basis. What we saw was an immediate increase in the number of safeguarding incidents from the beginning of the pandemic. Significantly so. That impact has sustained, and if not continued to grow really since the pandemic. So we were referring or notifying others about significant concerns we had about the welfare of individuals as on a weekly basis, as many times as we would have monthly, I suppose, before the pandemic. It's now even higher really than that.
And what's the reason for that, in your opinion?
The immediate, I suppose, impact of the pandemic on people's mental health, their resilience, their ability to cope. I think it exacerbated existing trauma. Remember, we're working with people who are experiencing trauma because they've been a victim of crime, but also the loss of coping mechanisms, support mechanisms, the lack of psychological support, particularly within the NHS, was an issue, and it is an ongoing issue. We are now, without doubt, dealing with more traumatised people for a longer period of time, and that is true across the whole sector. And also the impact of the system, so delays in the system, delays in court, that is most definitely having an impact. We see spikes in safeguarding incidents when, for example, repeated adjournments are made in court cases, that kind of thing. So it's all of those things, I think, having a compounding impact together.
And maybe just touching on a few of those points, in terms of support and coping mechanisms, I think you say at paragraph 17 of your statement that people relied on family and friends, and that became more difficult because of the social restrictions. Is that
That's right.
A fair point?
Yeah.
And you also mentioned in the same paragraph that the closure of health and fitness centres has had an impact. Yeah.
Things that people would have been doing to try and prevent issues and keep their mental well-being in good shape, that those often were not available to them. And then yes, I say psychological support services really not being available to people who needed it, and that lack of access has continued post-pandemic.
And you mentioned delays in court, and I don't think this is within your statement because I think this is something we discussed when we met, but can you tell us about the 90-day adjournment that was introduced and how that impacted on your service users?
Yeah, so during the pandemic, because when court business was paused, the practice the SCTS employed, I'm sure with the best of intention, was to put 90-day adjournments, administrative adjournments on their system, COP2, which we have access to. The challenge with that was that these repeated 90-day adjournments, as we started to move out of the pandemic, you were so used to these 90-day adjournments, then administrative adjournments going in, it became really unclear as to when a court date was actually going to go ahead, or whether or not there was going to be another 90-day adjournment put in, because often it was quite last minute that they were updated onto the system. So that made planning for resource planning around court coming out of the pandemic, when we were starting to see some cases being heard, really, really difficult, because you couldn't really trust the dates that were on the system because of this practice around automatic 90-day administrative adjournments.
And you talk about resource planning, but what about the actual people who are due to appear and give evidence? Did it impact upon them in terms of anxiety or anything else?
Court delays, adjournments remains a significant issue for victims and witnesses. Post-pandemic, what we are now seeing is repeated adjournments to a level and a scale that we didn't, in my experience, see before the pandemic. It's not unusual to hear of cases where there's been 6, 7 adjournments. That gearing yourself up to give evidence, as victims very often will describe, having to keep what's happened to them at the forefront of their mind, because they want to make sure they remember everything in case they're asked for details when they're giving evidence, and that's really important. That means they don't feel as though they can move on with their life particularly. But you can imagine steeling yourself to go and give evidence and then being told last minute, very often on the day, that the case is not going ahead, feeling as though the rug's pulled up from under you, and then having to do that again and again and again. And we are aware from our experience that that is leading to witness attrition, because eventually after 4 or 5 adjournments you start to doubt that the case is ever going to go ahead, and you stop turning up. There was also it was very challenging in terms of communication with witnesses, so it became very difficult for them to understand whether they were actually being cited to attend or whether they were, you'll know this phrase, countermanded. That was all very confusing and difficult for folks, so really understanding about whether you were expected to turn up or not, and that does still remain a bit of an issue now too.
Okay. So there's a long-lasting legacy essentially of the effects of the pandemic.
Yeah, definitely.
In terms of turning to domestic violence, what services does VSS offer in relation to victims of domestic violence?
So we support, as I said earlier on, victims of any type of crime, so and that will include domestic abuse, so emotional support, practical support too. In the early stages of the pandemic, we were really concerned about the financial impact and the lack of financial support for victims who may be experiencing quite profound impacts. So we upscaled, I guess, our victims fund, and that's one of the main things for victims of domestic abuse. It's mostly used for that, where we will buy goods and services on behalf of someone that has a financial need as a result of a crime, but also doesn't have the means themselves to pay for it. And domestic abuse, that would commonly be things like paying for a removal company to help move out of the home. It would be clothes, food vouchers, if you've had to just flee very quickly with the clothes on your back and the kids' back, that kind of thing. And we did quite a bit of that during the pandemic in terms of domestic abuse, I would say. So yeah, and across the country, really. So, and we will also link people into other specialist support if that is something that would better meet their needs.
And I think you mentioned removal, and I think you deal with rehousing of domestic violence victims, and you deal with that, I think, paragraph 27 and 28. And you mentioned that there was issues with restrictions in travel, removal, and the availability of housing. I think we probably understand the issue of removal. Can you tell us what the particular difficulties were with the availability of housing and also the restrictions in travel, how they impacted rehousing domestic violence victims?
I think the challenge was initially because the overall message was not to travel. So because, in my view, that wasn't nuanced enough at an early stage, and I understand why, it meant that you had a lot of domestic abuse survivors who felt that they were unable to flee the home and unable to get to safety because they would have been, in effect, breaking the law if they did that. So that took a long time to try and undo. Once those messages get out there, it becomes really difficult to undo them. So that was the first challenge. so persuading people that they actually did have a choice and they potentially could leave the home and they could be supported to do that was really difficult. And then, as I say, yeah, the alternative housing was really challenging. There wasn't much options around. It was really difficult. And then also trying to get, as you can imagine from our perspective, removal companies to help that are trusted, that will keep things confidential in that type of setting. That's quite a niche area too, and quite difficult. So that did take a lot of planning and a lot of organising. But certainly, looking back from now to then, it was a lot more of a struggle at the time than we're experiencing.
And in terms of just availability of housing, I understand there's a national housing crisis, but I'm just wondering why the pandemic had a particular effect on the availability of suitable housing for victims of domestic violence.
I'm probably not the best person to answer on that. Housing providers might well be.
That's
that
fine.
was their experience.
No, if you're not the appropriate person, I won't press you on it. You mentioned there the messages getting out to people, and it's perhaps moving on to communications with the Scottish Government and guidance. I mean, during the pandemic, did Victim Support Scotland take part in any groups or task forces set up by the Scottish Government?
So, during the so a bit of a way into the pandemic, I was asked if I would sit on the Justice Board COVID subgroup, which was a group that met every Thursday. I was the only third sector organisation, and in fact the only victims representative organisation asked to sit on that group. That was a bit into the pandemic. Our funding stream, the Scottish Government team that deals with our funding, did set up regular meetings to find out from all of us that were funded through that pot about the impact on us as organisations and on the people that we supported. Initially that was done on a really quite, I think they were doing it every fortnight, that meeting, and then they stepped it down to every month. So there was a couple of ways once we were in it. We weren't involved in any pre-pandemic planning whatsoever. That wasn't ever done with us. And still hasn't been done with us. But there were attempts, yes, to involve us in some bits and pieces.
In terms of those attempts, did you find that a positive experience in terms of having sufficient time to prepare and contribute to the meetings? So
the meetings where it was the funding stream group of organisations that came together with Scottish Government were really useful. That led to some publications of reports around impact on the pandemic on domestic abuse survivors, for example, and those were given a bit more time to air issues and really try and talk about the impacts. What they didn't do though was have anybody with any expert knowledge about how, for example, the guidance should be interpreted for our organisation. So the kind of pandemic official bit was missing, I guess, if you like, out of that. The other one, which was the COVID Justice Group, was very short, sharp, and often asked for information in a very, very quick timescale. My role within that was to represent VSS, but I was also being asked to represent other third sector and victim and survivor organisations too. There wasn't a lot of time, and that was a main mechanism, I suppose, to feed in questions to the Justice Hub. Often answers didn't come back or not in a timely way. But yeah, it was an attempt, and I appreciate the attempt. But it was very challenging in terms of some of the turnaround times, and not always getting the clarity of answers that you would like, I suppose, with hindsight.
And Dealing, I think you mentioned guidance there, and you look at guidance in paragraph 32 of your statement. In your opinion, generally, was the guidance, insofar as it affected your staff, your volunteers and the service users you represent, was it sufficiently clear?
No, I mean, this is an area where the guidance, the feeling really at the time was from us and other third sector organisations working with victims and survivors of crime was that the guidance was really difficult to interpret for our work. And an example that I think I've given you is about, for example, the face mask guidance. So understanding whether that was an absolute or whether there were situations where you could vary on that to suit because of the particular needs that you had for the person that you were working with. As somebody running an organisation, that was very unclear and it was very difficult to interpret, and I know other leaders of other third sector organisations felt exactly the same way. That you were reading the guidance going, that doesn't really, I'm struggling to see how we could actually make that work in our organisation and deliver the type of service that we need to deliver. So yeah.
And I think you deal with this in paragraph 32, but I'll let you put it in your own words. But victims of sexual assault was a particular issue that turned on the kind of use of masks. Can you explain that?
Well, I use that as an example, but actually there was other victims that it would apply to as well. Not being able to see the face of the person who's supporting you can, if you're trying to provide a trauma-informed and a trauma-responsive service, that does not lend itself very well to that at all. And you had some people who were absolutely terrified of people in face masks because potentially in the example of sexual crime, they may well have been attacked by someone who was wearing a face mask, and that was very difficult because what was not clear was whether there was any justification or whether we could make a risk assessment decision that meant that we could do something different for that person, because what we were potentially doing was re-traumatising them and harming them more.
Thank you. And you go on after paragraph 32 to deal with key worker classification. Were any of the staff or volunteers working with VSS classified as key workers through their role with VSS? So
this, from my experience, the key worker classification was really not clear. So at the beginning, we effectively took a decision ourselves that the volunteers, for example, were essential key workers. We looked at the different gradings at the beginning. Remember, there was different numbers, and we applied those. And I provided letters to people, but they were letters from me. And I was trying to seek clarification on where where did you get a clear answer about key worker status, and that didn't really I didn't really get an answer from that. And then there was, my experience is there was a change, and the change was that key worker status began to be associated with an organisation who was registered with the Care Inspectorate in terms of health and social care. So after that, we would not have met that classification. We are not registered with the Care Inspectorate. We're not a regulated body in that way. And that started having an impact then on, so there was a change in, for example, PPE procurement routes. Before we had an access into the government procurement route, that changed and stopped. And also it had an impact on, for example, we weren't eligible for employee testing or for vaccination boosters either. So that was my experience of the key work classification. Is for the type of organisation we were, it did not work well, and it was not clear.
Thank you. And I think you deal with vaccination at paragraphs 38 and 39 of your statement. I think essentially what you're saying is staff and volunteers weren't prioritised for vaccination.
No. And
would there have been a benefit to your volunteers, for instance, being prioritised for vaccination?
Absolutely. I mean, from as an example, the challenges I described in court and about volunteers feeling as though court was an unsafe place, having priority within vaccinations, boosters, testing, that would have made a big difference and helped reassure volunteers that it was a safe environment for them to be in, and we would have been able to potentially get a lot more volunteers back into courts a lot earlier.
And perhaps some of the ones that had left might not have left.
Exactly, exactly. Another thing, I think this is the point you were alluding to earlier on, we did end up having staff trying to fill that gap. That is effectively what happened, but of course we're only 100 of a staff team, so that was not sufficient to cover, you know, the resources that were required, particularly in court.
And then you turn in your statement at paragraphs 40 and 41 to the supply, distribution and use of PPE. I think you've already touched on it, that the PPE wasn't as freely available as to organisations which were registered under the Care Inspectorate. How did you source PPE, and what was the impact of the cost of it on the organisation?
So we already had, luckily, an account with the same organisation that was being used as one of the government procurement networks. It did cost a considerable amount. However, the way we managed that was we were saving money in other areas. For example, volunteer expenses, because we had a lot fewer volunteers. So we did get some additional help with that, but it didn't require as much as perhaps other organisations. And I do understand why PPE was being prioritised within health, for example, and social care. However, it did present significant challenges for us. One of the things in terms of that leadership role that I was describing across the sector was I became very, very worried when procurement routes for PPE were not available through the official channels to us and other organisations, was that some organisations would start using let's just say procurement routes that would have lent themselves to counterfeit goods more, and that was a concern for me in terms of PPE as time went on.
Thank you. You move on to paragraphs 50 to 53 with digital exclusion, and I was going to ask about your staff and IT. I wonder if I perhaps overlooked, we've talked about volunteers leaving as a result of the restrictions in the courts and the various other factors. Staff, did you find that you were losing more staff than you would normally expect to lose at the pandemic?
Yes, but not through digital issues. That was
right.
More through mental health impacts. We did, as I say in my statement, we definitely lost a member of staff that was to do with working from home, bringing trauma into their own house, and feeling as though their safe space had been violated because the work was invading their home, if you like. That did have an impact on other staff too. I think in total I would say about 8 people that I can think of left organisation where that was a contributory factor.
Okay. And in terms of the staff, are they all the 100 staff? Are they largely all based in one set of offices, or have you got 2 or how's that?
We've got offices all across the country, right. So yeah, a lot of offices across the country, and also, as you know, co-located within courts. So at the very beginning of the pandemic, when we weren't allowed into offices, people did immediately start working from home, but that's where the problems, I suppose, really began, and we put significant amount of support in. However, that did have definitely had an impact.
And when the staff did start working from home rather than be office-based, was there any issues with availability of IT?
Not particularly for us. We were quite lucky in that we were already working off of Microsoft Teams prior to the pandemic, so we had already introduced that across the organisation. So that side of things was okay. We had a bit to do in terms of changing some desktops into laptops, that kind of thing, but that wasn't significant for us. We did buy a significant amount of office furniture as well, though, because I was worried about health and safety and people using laptops on their knee, on sofas, that kind of thing. So we did get some funding for that, and some people didn't have great internet at home, so we had to work on that in terms of Wi-Fi dongles and all that kind of thing. But for us, we were actually pretty okay, and on that side of things, certainly staff-wise.
And you say certainly staff-wise, maybe looking at the service users. Now, I appreciate a lot of the services that pre-pandemic that VSS were providing were in court, but we've also talked about rehousing domestic abuse victims. Was there any IT issues communicating with? Did they have access to IT in order to communicate with the staff or the volunteers?
So. Yeah, so historically and traditionally that type of support, so the practical and emotional support for victims of crime as opposed to witnesses, would normally be done in a face-to-face manner. That's normally the way that you would engender trust and get a rapport quickly. So we would have typically done that through an office appointment or actually going to somebody's home. So that was completely disrupted, and we tried to find other ways of doing it. We were a very early adopter of Near Me, which is a video conferencing technology, as you know, that NHS used for GP appointments, but really victims struggled to use that. I would say there was very, very low uptake. And it did rely, you know, we did move over to doing quite a bit of phone support. That has continued as well, but definitely there was challenges in terms of digital exclusion, and we were not providing the same level of service as we had been before. We did have, of course, the Victims Fund at that time, now called the Emergency Assistance Fund, and we were giving people devices if that was what they needed and what would help. However, it wasn't the same in terms of the type of support they were getting from us.
I mean, would that, and I'm just thinking aloud, but would that be, if somebody's suffering from domestic violence, if they all of a sudden have an iPad, would that not be a red flag to in the household?
Yeah, and you have to take care around that. We have a live chat function on our website, and we always had that, but we certainly saw an increased level of use on that. And the live chat is where you can type in questions, because one of the challenges, of course, is you can't be offering, if you're trapped in the home with your abuser, you can't phone a helpline to get help without putting yourself at further risk. So the live chat worked really well, where people could type in and get support from us as a real person typing back. And we've also got stealth technology built into that, so you can move off of it and the screen disappears and nobody can see it in your browser history. So certainly, yes, we made use of that, and we really did try our best, but there's no doubt there was challenges there. And for the Emergency Assistance Fund and giving people devices, it would not have been appropriate in those settings if potentially it was putting people at further risk.
We've discussed guidance, and you deal with the Scottish Government guidance at paragraphs 54 to 57 of your statement. Did the Scottish Court Service also issue guidance?
Yes, they did at times about numbers of people. My experience was in terms of numbers of people that were allowed in courts, and about court closures. So yes, there was guidance at various times. Was it helpful and clear? At times, yes. When it was given, this, I guess my experience was that there was some really important key moments where guidance wasn't provided or information shared ahead of time. An example of that was coming out of the pandemic, where there was a decision made to increase the number of sheriff and jury trials and to use outlying courts for that, because they had maybe more capacity. So courts in more rural areas, for example, we were never told about that ahead of time, yet that had a massive impact on my organisation, because we were expected to provide support in areas where potentially we didn't have a huge number of volunteers in more rural areas. So that did cause a problem. And in the final chapter of your statement, you go through various lessons for the inquiry, and it's quite a comprehensive list. I wonder if I could go through just a few of those, and if there's any that, once I've gone through those, if there's any that you think that were more important than others that I've omitted, I'll give you an opportunity to raise that. At paragraph 58, you should say that there should be a whole system approach to understanding the impacts
on the different sections of the justice system. I'm just wondering what you're suggesting should be done or could be done.
So, inquiries like these, I think, are really important, obviously, in terms of learning lessons. I think what I would like to see is the justice system as a whole spending some time together, reflecting and doing in a way what this, and taking some of the lessons from this inquiry and reflecting back on how it approached things and how it would potentially approach things differently in future and what would need to be done there. And what I mean by a whole system approach is really involving all of the key stakeholders in the justice system. That includes third sector organisations, and it includes those that support victims and witnesses, and in fact victims and witnesses themselves. So, you know, planning to do things differently in the future, and what would we do differently in the future if another similar situation occurred, is what I meant by that.
Okay. At paragraph 61, you talk of creating specific well-being and mental health supports. I'm just wondering, in practical terms, if you're thinking of something within the courts or out with the courts. I'm just wondering what you're talking of there.
I was actually thinking about, and when I wrote that, I was thinking more about something bridging, I suppose, probably the NHS and the justice system. There's a lot of, well, there's not a lot of, but because it's difficult to get access to, but there's trauma support services that exist. But what they often don't have is their generic trauma support systems, support organisations or programmes. They don't have a justice element, and what we're seeing now is you've people traumatised from being a victim of crime, but then being re-traumatised by the impact of the justice system itself. And that's what I mean, is exploring particular programmes and support interventions that can cover both of those in a way. We have victims come to us who talk about generic psychological support services as not being relevant for them. Families bereaved by murder and culpable homicide, for example, will regularly, unfortunately, tell us that, you know, counsellors or therapists that they've seen have been absolutely not themselves capable of hearing and listening what that victim's experience has been, and have themselves got upset. That's not an unusual occurrence, and I suppose that's what I meant by that, was more about something specialist that bridges both.
Okay, thank you. And at paragraph 67, you state that courts should have been shut down earlier for safety reasons, and I understand your point there, but you also talk within your statement about delays in the court system caused by, obviously, the courts working with reduced numbers of prosecutions. I'm just wondering, is there a particular, I mean, there may not be a solution, but do you have some kind of solution in mind?
I mean, it's a source of big regret to me, and I do reflect on whether I could have personally done more around this, but the lack of use of properly remote proceedings, I think, and you know, there was a pilot done, and I think less than 10 trials went ahead fully remotely. If we had been braver, more creative, and more open-minded, I suppose, and prioritised actually the impact on victims and witnesses, then I think we may well have come up with other solutions. I was struck when I went to the Netherlands in April last year. Their court proceedings are almost entirely remote. They don't have victims given what they would describe as live testimony in court. They're on the judge sits with screens all round them, and they had very little to no impact on their criminal justice system because of the pandemic, because they were already pretty much fully remote. And I do think that I would hope that Scotland would learn lessons really from that aspect. That would have made a huge difference. We would not be seeing the backlog and the long-term impact of that backlog, and you know, now, and the weight that they were expecting people you know, I've described it in other places as being inhumane, really, what we're asking people to do in terms of, and asking them possible, I think, in a justice system for somebody to remember something, you know, 3, 4, 5 years later. To me, the imperative is to do better for future.
Thank you. I said I would give you, and under the lessons learned, I'll give you an opportunity to, obviously, if there's any other points that you wish to make. Under lessons learned, I don't know if there's anything in particular that you think is important or more important than the points I've made that should be flagged up. What I would say is your statement is there as evidence. It's before the inquiry, so it's certainly not necessary to identify, but if there's anything in particular.
I think for me, there's a mindset around keeping open-minded and remembering the different people who are impacted, and thinking about strategies and approaches around that. Very often in VSS we were deprioritised because we were a third sector organisation. We weren't part of often the official channels that were receiving communication direct from Scottish Government. So that was a challenge. So a combination of being supporting victims that are often forgotten about in the system, as well as being a charity and a third sector organisation, I think had a double impact. And I suppose, yeah, in terms of lessons learned, it's having that mindset across all organisations who are involved, that they think about the impact on all the different people who are using the system, and how they might involve, plan ahead, and mitigate some of the risks. I think is important going forward.
And finally, I was going to say, if there's anything you wish to add, I've got Netherlands written down, but you've already mentioned that because you didn't deal with that in your statement, but you mentioned it to me when we met. Is there anything else that you wish to add on behalf of the organisation?
Sorry, I missed.
Sorry, Netherlands. The only other thing I was going to ask you about was the Netherlands, which I think you mentioned when we met, but there's no mention to the Netherlands remote system of hearing criminal court cases. So other than that, is there anything else you would like to say before I thank you for your time?
No, I think that's everything. Thank you.
Well, I'll just simply thank you for your time then, and not just simply today, but also the preparation of this detailed statement, which is before the inquiry.
Before you go, let me ask you a little more about Holland. You said you went to the Netherlands.
Yes.
You didn't tell us, were you there as part of a study group or as part of an organised course to see the criminal justice system in organisation and operation?
I was actually invited to present to Eurojust, who were meeting in The Hague, and that was to do with a pioneering project that we have around virtual reality. So it's virtual reality court tours. So one of the things, obviously, that happened during the pandemic was the ability to go into court for a familiarisation visit prior to then giving evidence was almost impossible. So what we've developed is remote, on a virtual reality headset, so tours of every single court in Scotland plus remote suite, and it's got all the people in it, and you can click on them and ask, and they tell you what it is that they do. So we were asked to present that, and as part of that, I think we were the only, we were the only third sector organisation. We were the only organisation of our type really presenting, and that was where we had a bit of a conversation. Because in a way, why do you need to? That was the question. Why do you need people to see the court beforehand? And I was like, so that they're familiar with it before they give evidence. And the Netherlands representative was saying, oh, but we don't need that because people don't actually come to court. So that was where that came from, and then that sparked a kind of follow-up conversation. But yeah, and they showed pictures of courtrooms where the judge was sitting just with lots of screens round about them and really no other people in the room.
All right, that's helpful. If you'd like, I understand it's not in your statement, if you feel you'd like to say something more about that, because it is actually quite interesting, novel to my experience as well, please feel free to submit it to the appropriate person in any way you want, and an addendum to your statement or further information, and we'd be happy to look at that.
Okay, will do.
Good.
Thank you.
Very much, Steve.
Well, Lloyd, I'll speak to Ms Wallace immediately after.
Super.
evidence.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, I don't actually think we're due back to 11:30.
No, I'm not sure.
I'm just looking at the programme in front of me.
Yes, sorry, I've gone through slightly
you don't need
quicker.
to apologise, that's fine. I've got plenty of things I can do. So, 11:30.
Obliged.
Good morning, Mr. Turner.
Good morning, my lord. The next witness, my lord, is Ms. Sandy Brindley of Rape Crisis Scotland.
Good morning, Miss Brindley.
Good morning.
Right. Yes, Mr. Turner, over to you.
Good morning, Ms. Brindley. Before I begin, just a brief reminder that this morning's evidence, or this afternoon's evidence, will be transcribed. If you could try and speak as clearly and slowly as possible, that will assist our stenographers. First of all, could I ask you please to state your full name?
Yes, my name's Sandy Brindley.
And what is your current role?
I'm the Chief Executive at Rape Crisis Scotland.
Thank you. And you have provided a written statement to the inquiry, is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. That statement, my lord, is reference SCI WT 0224 number 1. And just to confirm, Ms. Brindley, everything that you've given to the inquiry in terms of that statement and documents will be taken into account, even if we don't have the opportunity this morning in our short time to get to everything. You're here, Ms. Brindley, to represent Rape Crisis Scotland. I'd like to ask you a few questions about that first of all, but before we get there, could I ask you how long you've been with Rape Crisis Scotland?
Yes, I started at Rape Crisis Scotland in January 2003 when I had previously worked at Glasgow Rape Crisis and left there to set up the national body, which is Rape Crisis Scotland.
Thank you. And what does your role involve for Rape Crisis Scotland?
So my role is really being responsible for the overall strategy of the organisation in conjunction with our board of directors, supporting our leadership team and making sure that we meet our charitable objectives.
Thank you. And who are the members of Rape Crisis Scotland?
We have 16 member Rape Crisis Centres, so we're an umbrella body. Rape Crisis Scotland itself runs a number of services, including the National Helpline, which is a first point of contact for anyone in Scotland experiencing sexual violence. But we also support the work of 16 independent local Rape Crisis Centres who have their own board of directors and staffing, and who provide direct services in their locality to survivors of rape. So our centres are located as geographically dispersed as Shetland, Orkney, right down to Dumfries and Galloway.
Thank you. You've mentioned the dispersed. Which parts of Scotland are actually covered by the centres? So
it covers the whole of Scotland. There's one Rape Crisis Centre that's not a member of Rape Crisis Scotland, which is Glasgow Rape Crisis, but including Glasgow Rape Crisis, pretty much every area of Scotland is now covered by Rape Crisis services.
Thank you. And could you explain to His Lordship very briefly what the relationship is between Rape Crisis Scotland and the member organisations, member centres?
Yeah, so we're there to support our member centres to try to campaign for more funding and more resources for Rape Crisis Centres. They're independent, but they're members of Rape Crisis Scotland, meaning that no matter where somebody lives in Scotland, they should be able to expect a certain level of service from a Rape Crisis Centre because everyone's working to the same national standards that apply in Scotland and in England and Wales.
Thank you. We will, of course, we're here to discuss the COVID pandemic, and we'll come on to discuss the effects of that in a moment. But first of all, I would like to give His Lordship a bit of an idea of the work of Rape Crisis Scotland and indeed the Rape Crisis Centres more generally. Could you perhaps describe for His Lordship who the centres help?
So the centres are in the main there for anyone who's been affected by sexual violence. So overwhelmingly it's women using our services, but we also support male survivors of sexual violence. That might be adult rape survivors, or it might be men who have been sexually abused as children. We also provide support to friends, to family members. So it might be, for example, a mother contacts us to say she's discovered her daughter's been raped and is looking for a bit of support and guidance around how to help her. So really anyone affected by sexual violence in Scotland can access our helpline at Rape Crisis Scotland.
Thank you. You've used the term there, sexual violence. That from your description encompasses a number of different things. Could you Could you elaborate on what those might be?
That's correct. We have rape in the title of our organisation, but we support anyone affected by any form of sexual violence. So that could be child sexual abuse, it could be sexual assault, it could be rape, it could be somebody who has had intimate images of them taken without consent and shared without their consent. So really anyone affected by any form of sexual violence can access our services, and the sexual violence can be committed by anyone. I mean, it is overwhelmingly men who are committing the sexual violence that we are supporting survivors in relation to. It's about 96% of perpetrators are male, but there are some female perpetrators as well.
Thank you. You've mentioned there the sex of the perpetrators. In general terms, are you able to give any indication to His Lordship about the identity of perpetrators that you've come across in terms of your experience?
Most often it's someone known to the victim, whether it's a partner, an ex-partner, a family member, a work colleague or an acquaintance. It's between 7 and 8% of rape survivors in touch with us have been raped by a stranger. That is very much, it does happen, but it's very much in the minority. It is overwhelmingly somebody known to the survivor who's perpetrated the attack or attacks.
And where do those attacks tend to happen?
Most commonly in the victim's home. The second most common location is the perpetrator's home.
And do these incidences, are they isolated, or are they part of a pattern?
It can really vary. Some survivors contact us about a one-off incident, for example, a rape that's maybe happened in a work night out with a colleague. For other survivors, it's very much about a pattern of behaviour, so possibly rape over a number of years by a partner or a husband.
Thank you. And in terms of demographics, are you able to tell us anything about the ages of people contacting Rape Crisis?
Yes, we provide support through the national helpline to anyone aged 13 and over, and we do get calls from under 16s, but it's primarily people between the age of 16 and 60, although we do absolutely get calls from people who are older than 60 as well. So it's not uncommon for somebody to contact us maybe in their 70s and to say this is the first time they've spoken about what's happened to them, and it's something that happened a long time ago.
Thank you. Again, just talking in generality before we get to the pandemic, how do people engage with Rape Crisis?
So it can be in a variety of ways. Our helpline is one of the key ways that people make contacts. We're a first point of contact for survivors in Scotland. We would explore with them what they're looking for, and then we would link them into their local centre, for example, if they're looking for ongoing counselling or face-to-face support. We'll talk about this during my evidence, but we have really developed, as a result of the pandemic, the methods that somebody can make contact with us, and more and more we're seeing people, particularly young people, wanting to access our service through text messaging or instant messaging.
Thank you. Do you receive referrals from any agencies?
We do receive referrals from Police Scotland. We have a protocol which is an opt-out referral process with Police Scotland for any what's considered serious sexual offences. Where somebody's over 16, they'll be automatically referred to the Rape Crisis helpline. And that's actually in recognition of the fact when somebody's just been raped or just reported a sexual offence, it can be really difficult for them to pick up the phone and make contact. That's a really difficult thing for somebody to do, I think, to seek support for the first time after an incident of sexual violence, so that the police will put people directly in touch with us. Another really important part of that protocol we have with Police Scotland is we have a feedback process where appropriate, we'll ask complainers, ask survivors at the end of the call a small number of agreed questions that we've agreed with the police about their experience of reporting, which means the police can get direct feedback on a monthly basis about what are the issues coming up and what are survivors' experiences of reporting. We have a similar protocol with the Crown Office as well, and I think that's so important that justice agencies are able to hear directly from survivors, from complainers, about their experience of the process.
it may be implicit from what you were saying there about referrals, but can you give his lordship, and I appreciate this will not be a one-size-fits-all, but can you give his lordship an indication of at what stage in the history of a survivor rape crisis becomes involved?
It can really vary. So, somebody might contact us the day after to say, I've just been raped, I don't know what to do. For others, quite some time might have passed, so that most commonly it's over a year before somebody seeks support from a rape crisis service, excluding the police referral protocol, which will be immediately after somebody's reported a sexual offence. So there can be significant delays in people seeking support. And what we know is that some people never seek support, that maybe because they rely on friends or family or informal support mechanisms, but it may just be that it feels too difficult for some people to pick up the phone and contact a service like ours.
Thank you. And again, just talking about pre or post-pandemic, how are those services provided normally?
So normally provided for Rape Crisis Scotland, it's primarily a telephone and text service. For our local centres, it's primarily in person, although in the pandemic, centres moved very much to online provision. And some of that legacy continues, where some people might prefer or find it easier to make contact by text or online rather than having to come in person. So that, I suppose, is one of the positive legacies of COVID, is the way we really quickly reshaped our services did mean that some of the services were maybe a bit more accessible for people that didn't feel able to come in and sit down in a room and speak to somebody, and that continues to this day, that our centres provide that service.
And what kind of services are those that are being provided at that time?
So we provide ongoing emotional support to survivors of sexual violence, but we also provide advocacy support. So we coordinate at Rape Crisis Scotland a national advocacy service which supports sexual offence complainers through the justice process. So that can be right at the very start of thinking about, do I want to report, having somebody to talk that through with, right through to court and beyond. So the advocacy support that we've been providing to survivors through this service, which operates across Scotland, really I think is invaluable to help people navigate the justice process.
Thank you. I'll come back to the advocacy in a moment. That obviously deals with, I suppose, the initial stages in terms of reporting and helping survivors at that stage. In terms of the following stages, in terms of, for want of a better word, recovery, that's maybe a poor word, but other services that are offered?
Yeah, yes, our local rape crisis centres provide ongoing support to survivors to help them rebuild their lives following rape, which I think people sometimes think rape is a crime that can destroy your life, and it absolutely does change your life, but it is very, very possible, particularly with support, to rebuild your life and to move forward in your life following a crime as traumatic as rape. And that is a really crucial service that our centres provide, is standing with somebody and supporting them through that process of rebuilding their lives.
And what would that look like? What would those services look like ordinarily? So
it would often be weekly one-to-one support sessions, but it can be very determined by what the survivor is looking for. What one survivor wants or needs can be really different to what another survivor needs or wants. It's very much tailored to the individual's needs. Some people might really benefit from weekly support sessions over a period of months. Others, that maybe wouldn't work for them. It's something quite different or more ad hoc that they're looking for. So our services are fundamentally tailored to what the survivor says they need. At the start of every support contact, our centres would do a needs assessment just to talk through our survivor, what's important to them, what do they feel would help them, and just going through the range of services provided.
You've mentioned a number of services. In terms of the individuals who are providing those services at rape crisis centres and indeed in Rape Crisis Scotland, can you describe who those people are?
Yeah, so it's a mix of paid and unpaid staff that we have in the Rape Crisis movement. I personally started off as a volunteer at Glasgow Rape Crisis in 1994. So volunteering and unpaid work has always been a really, really important part of the Rape Crisis movement. Really our services were built on women who are really committed to providing services to survivors of sexual violence, and it continues to this day that we're heavily reliant on volunteers, but we also have a significant number of paid staff across the country and based within Rape Crisis Scotland.
Thank you. We've spoken there about the Rape Crisis Centres. You've spoken about the National Advocacy Service, which, as I say, we can touch upon again in a moment. But looking at Rape Crisis Scotland itself, are there any other campaigns or programmes that it provides?
Yes, so we also coordinate a prevention programme, working in schools and high schools across Scotland, working with young people on issues around consent and healthy relationships. This is a really, really important initiative that we've been running for a number of years. It's been externally evaluated, and what young people say is that having this space with somebody external who's coming in, like not their teacher, to discuss these sensitive issues can really, really make a difference to how people feel. I think it also just highlights to young people there's support there if there is something going on in their life.
Thank you. I think that's given His Lordship quite a nice base, if I can put it that way, in terms of what was happening before the pandemic. If we could perhaps look now towards the pandemic. At the start of the pandemic, we obviously moved very quickly into a lockdown situation. Could you describe for His Lordship what effect that had in terms of the delivery of services by Rape Crisis?
It had a profound impact, particularly for our local centres, where almost all the support at the time they were providing was face-to-face. That had to stop immediately. Certainly for us at Rape Crisis Scotland, in terms of running our helpline, we had to immediately assess how do we continue providing support to survivors in this very, very changed landscape of a lockdown. But we're very grateful to the Scottish Government provided funding very, very quickly, which was really essential for us and for our member centres to cover the cost of the technology we needed to be able to quickly change how we delivered our services. And I think it really is testament to our staff at Rape Crisis Scotland, but also the staff and volunteers and centres across Scotland, that we did keep providing our services during this really, really difficult, extraordinary time, and that survivors were able to still get support, which they told us was really crucial to them, to help them navigate what was clearly a very difficult time.
So looking, if we can take it incrementally, looking at the start of lockdown, and obviously that, you've mentioned there that prevented access to certain services, what steps were taken first of all to address that?
So for us at Rape Crisis Scotland, for our helpline, we stood down our volunteers because we took the decision that we couldn't ask volunteers to provide the service in these circumstances during a lockdown. We looked at setting up systems where we could provide remote access, so where our staff could run the helpline sessions from their home. But really the key for us was to find a way to still provide a service to survivors, because what we knew was that in these really extraordinary times our service would be needed more than ever. Another key development was setting up our text relay service where people could make contact via text, and the demand in this really quickly was significant, so people texting us looking for support and getting support via text message. I think that was a really innovative development for us, and it's one that we still run to this day and that's really, really heavily used.
Just so that we understand, so ordinarily before the pandemic, the national helplines run by Rape Crisis Scotland as opposed to the centres.
Yeah, that's correct.
And it it would be a first point of contact, but thereafter, what would happen to the contacts, the survivors that are contacting the centre?
So if somebody was looking for, I mean, some people do just want to, say if it may be something that's just happened, they want to make contact, they want to get some initial support and some guidance around, for example, if they want to report to the police or if they want to undergo a forensic examination, but it might be that that's enough for them at that point and they don't come back again until a few months later, at which point they're looking for something more ongoing. For others, they might contact and what they're looking for is ongoing face-to-face or ongoing emotional support or counselling, in which case we would then link them in to their local centre. I mean, what we did find during the pandemic and particularly during the lockdown was that we had much more ongoing support being provided through our helpline, just because there was so few services available. This was really noticeable for our helpline staff, with survivors talking about all their normal coping mechanisms not being there. So maybe the way they coped with the trauma they'd been through was going to the gym, was maybe accessing other mental health services, informal support networks through friends. They really pretty much all went for survivors with lockdown happening, which made services like ours even more important. And that is what survivors would say to us regularly, is that I'm so grateful that you're still there.
You've mentioned there the text service that was set up. Was there any particular reason why a text service was necessary?
Yes, what we found was that survivors were having difficulty having the privacy to make a phone call, particularly once lockdown started. I mean, that may be because they were living with the person that was raping or abusing them, or it may be just that they didn't want the people in their household to know what was happening. So we had people phoning us from cupboards, from their garden, just trying to find any way to make contact in a private manner. So setting up a text service, and the fact people used it so quickly and so much really demonstrated, I think, that people needed a safe and discreet way of access and support and making contact with agencies like ours during lockdown.
You've described the national helpline moving from volunteers to staff. In terms of the virtual call centre that you mentioned, did that increase the number of people who were involved with the national helpline? Yes,
what we did was we moved some volunteers onto a paid worker basis to enable us to staff the helpline, because losing our volunteers had a significant impact on us being able to staff the line. And as I say, our absolute priority was to still have a service there for survivors.
Thank you. So that's the national helpline. In terms of what was being offered by rape crisis centres, you've mentioned that they were able to get technology in place through assistance from the Scottish Government. What kinds of services were they able to offer?
So our centres moved to providing services over the phone, over platforms such as Zoom. Some also provided some level of tech support as well. I think a real dilemma for our centres, or for anybody working in the area of trauma, is whether or not to have staff providing support from their homes, because there's so many issues there to think about in terms of making sure somebody has a private space, but also then is bringing trauma into your home, where you're maybe like a few hours later sitting with your kids around the table in the same room. So there was a varied approach across our centres. Some centres did enable centres to provide staff to provide support from home. Others took the decision that it had to be provided from their centre. And what they did was just introduce specific measures within their centre for social distancing. So there was some variety in approaches across centres, but the commonality was that everybody was doing everything they could to still provide support to survivors of sexual crime during this very, very difficult period.
Do you feel, or do you know, that the levels of support that were provided over that period, what the effect on that was in terms of your ability to offer that support?
Yeah, I think both us at Rape Crisis Scotland and our centres initially saw a bit of a dip in the numbers contacting us. I think that really was, if we think back to the first lockdown, just the shock of how people's lives changed. But really quickly, the numbers started really increasing in terms of survivors contacting us and looking for support. And it included survivors who had never been in contact with us before, primarily because their support, normal coping mechanisms had fallen away, and that then led to them making contact with us for the first time. So we did see, thanks to another injection of funding from the Scottish Government, we have seen staffing increase across our centres to better meet the demand. And I think it is important to say that the starting point before COVID was that centres were under-resourced and unable to fully meet, or anywhere near fully meet, the demand on them. So though we've had some extra resources, it remains the case that there is far more demand for rape crisis services in Scotland than we're able to meet currently.
Thank you. I'd like to talk to you now about, I suppose, the other side of the coin, some of the experiences of survivors. You've mentioned that, particularly during the lockdown periods, things like gyms and other areas where people might use as coping mechanisms had closed. Were there other support services that would ordinarily be available affected by the lockdown?
Yes, almost everything was affected by the lockdown in terms of services that were available. So private counsellors, for example, many put a hold on their services. Statutory service provision was dramatically impacted. What survivors would say to us is, you're the only service that I can find that I can get support from around sexual crime just now.
You've spoken this morning regarding rape crisis potentially getting involved quite early in the process in terms of a survivor's experience. In terms of that initial stages in the early aftermath of an incident, were there any effects on that during the lockdown periods?
We spoke to a number of survivors who were concerned about reporting to the police because they had been involved in activity that they shouldn't have been under the COVID regulations. So, for example, they were at a party, or they were with people that weren't part of their bubble, depending on what the regulations were at the time. And we did have regular meetings with Police Scotland during the pandemic, and they assured us that they were not interested. If somebody had been raped, that was what they were interested in. So we were able to pass that on to survivors in contact with us. But it definitely did deter some people from coming forward and reporting rape because they were worried they would get into trouble for breaking the lockdown regulations.
You've spoken there regarding involvement of the police, obviously, at the early stages. In terms of an initial reporting, are there other services who would ordinarily be involved with an early reporting of a rape?
I mean, the provision of forensic medical services is absolutely crucial. What we know is that forensic evidence can be essential to enable prosecution to move forward, because particularly of a requirement for corroboration in Scotland. And we did have feedback from one survivor that our forensic examination wasn't able to go ahead because she had a cough. And I don't want to say that was in any way widespread, but I think that example does highlight just how dramatic the impact of COVID was on rape survivors' access to justice if they couldn't even access a forensic examination. And what we know is that there are very tight time restrictions on when a forensic examination should be carried out to enable evidence to be collected, and the sooner the better is the advice for a forensic examination.
We've been speaking about, I suppose, the legal side of things in terms of forensic examinations and the police's involvement in that sort of early stages. Would rape survivors also be engaging health professionals at that time?
Yes, that's correct.
And was there any impact on that? from the pandemic?
There was a significant impact in being able to access any health service, sexual health services, any counselling being provided by the NHS. That there are so many health implications of rape, both in the immediate aftermath, but also in the weeks and months following a rape. And survivors' access to those was extremely restricted because of the pandemic. One issue in terms of accessing sexual health services, so there was an attempt to still provide these to rape survivors, but what it meant was somebody had to disclose that they had been raped to access sexual health services, and for many survivors they just didn't feel able to do that. What they wanted to do was access sexual health services without having to disclose, because disclosing that you've been raped is something that can be very difficult to do. Survivors often worry about how somebody will react to them, what kind of questions will they ask, will they be blamed in any way. So I think that was undoubtedly a barrier for rape survivors to access sexual health services in the aftermath of being raped, the fact that they would have to disclose what had happened to them.
Was there any way of addressing that?
I mean, I think we did have ongoing positive discussions with health, and I think it's important to recognise that these were really extraordinary circumstances we were all living in. People and agencies were trying to put systems in place really, really quickly at the same time as they were themselves in their own lives coping with the pandemic and trying to homeschool children. So I think there definitely was an attempt made to provide services as far as they could. But I mean, the NHS was under so much pressure, as we know, in responding to COVID.
We've spoken about the sort of initial stages of investigation, and we've also spoken about the National Advocacy Service. Would the National Advocacy Service get involved at that stage of the investigations ordinarily? Yes, somebody can access the National Advocacy Service at any point, so people may contact us even before they've reported, and then they can have one advocacy worker ideally with them throughout the whole process, or it might be at a particular point of the justice process triggers somebody being either referred into the National Advocacy Service or making contact themselves. So it might be, for example, they get a call saying that the case is proceeding to court, and that's when they'll contact us and say, look, I really need some help, I need somebody to support me through this. You've mentioned there, Ms Brindley, the access to court. Was there any impact on that during the pandemic? It was an absolutely devastating impact for rape and sexual offence survivors with the pandemic. Courts were closed entirely from March 2020. And again, the justice process was already in a very difficult position prior to the pandemic. Rape survivors were already waiting like significant periods of time for their case to get to court. So when lockdown happened and when trials were set aside and not running, you could have somebody who'd been waiting 2 years for their case to go ahead, anticipating a trial, for example, in a month's time, and then suddenly to be told it's not going ahead and we cannot tell you when it will go ahead. I cannot overstate the impact that had on rape survivors. Given evidence in a rape trial or a sexual offence trial can be an extremely daunting prospect. People are very anxious about giving evidence in a rape trial, and to then be told we have no idea when your trial will go ahead really devastated people's lives. What rape survivors said to us was they couldn't move on with their lives were on hold, but also in terms of the impact of trauma, because they felt that they may be called upon to give evidence at any point in the near or short-term future. They had to keep what happened in their minds so that they wouldn't forget any of the details they might be asked about. So what that meant was people constantly reliving their trauma, only to have this complete uncertainty about when they would be given evidence. Rape is a crime that takes complete control away from somebody, from their body, from their lives, from their wishes, and often why the justice process, in general terms, not talking about the pandemic, often why the justice process is so traumatic
is because it can replicate that lack of control. What survivors have said to me is that the justice process mirrors the lack of control they had while they were being raped. So that was an issue before the pandemic, it's an issue now. But what the pandemic did was introduce this huge uncertainty for survivors about when their case would be heard, if at all. And I think people are incredibly resilient and can cope with very difficult circumstances if they are communicated with, if they're treated with compassion, if there's some empathy about the position they're in. And what we did find, and that this is no criticism of any individual members of staff within the police or the Crown Office, but what we did find was that communication was really very poor. Complainers were simply being told, you'll hear again in 3 months. And for somebody who's been waiting to give evidence in a rape trial, maybe for 2 years already, like that just isn't good enough. It really significantly added to the trauma they were already experiencing, the quality of the communication they received about what was happening.
What do you think should have been done in those circumstances?
I think communication could have been better, even if it's simply to say to somebody, we understand how difficult this is, I don't have an update for you, but I will contact you again in 3 weeks' time and I will tell you then what I can. I think just basic communication in that manner could have really helped. I think that the other thing that the justice process did start to put in place that I think could have gone further, but I think was positive, was looking at pre-recorded evidence. Like, so somebody given their evidence in advance of trial, it being captured, so that, I mean, the trial, that somebody would still be waiting for the trial, but the most anxious part of the process is giving evidence and being cross-examined. So I think if you can do pre-recorded evidence, particularly in these circumstances, it takes at least quite a bit of the trauma away from somebody and that they've got their evidence done. So prior to the pandemic, pre-recorded evidence was happening, but it was primarily with children. It wasn't happening routinely in adult rape cases. So that is one positive I would say that the Crown Office put in place, was to try and move, and the justice process as a whole, was to try to move to increasing, and they did increase the amount of evidence and commissions, they're called, in adult rape cases. And I think that was really positive. I think it could have happened more. Another area that I think was helpful was we had ongoing communication with the Crown Office, like at really quite a senior level. So we had regular calls with the then Lord Advocate James Wolfe and with the Cabinet Secretary for Justice Hamza Yousaf, and that was a really helpful forum where we could raise at a really senior level, these are the issues for rape survivors, for sexual offence survivors. And I did very much get the impression the Lord Advocate was anxious that the justice process and the Crown Office did what they could to mitigate some of the trauma being experienced by rape survivors as a result of courts being closed. And one agreement that we came to with the Crown Office is that if we had somebody that we were supporting through the National Access Service who was really struggling to stay engaged and was thinking about withdrawing from the process, that we would speak to the Crown Office and those cases would be prioritised for pre-recorded evidence, which I think was really, really positive way of trying to keep people engaged, because it was not uncommon during this period for rape complainers to say to us, I cannot keep doing this, I cannot keep putting my life on hold, I want to withdraw from the process. So I think in those circumstances, to be able to put more support in place where we could, to have better communication and to be able to offer pre-recorded evidence, I think was really important.
Did Rape Crisis hear of people withdrawing from the process in terms of survivors?
Yes, we did hear of people withdrawing from the process. I mean, it's quite a complicated situation because somebody can't actually withdraw without it being signed off at a really senior level within the Crown Office. So there was some fear about if somebody withdrew, would they end up being charged? But people did withdraw from the process because they just couldn't bear it anymore, and I think that was entirely understandable.
Thank you. Just because we may have people watching your evidence, what do you mean by people concerned about being charged?
So I think the guidance from the Crown Office is that somebody can't automatically withdraw that they're a witness in a case. I mean, I don't think there's been a single case of since this guidance was introduced of a rape complainer being charged, but there is the possibility that if somebody says, I absolutely can't go through with this, in theory, there's a theoretical risk that they could be compelled to give evidence against their wishes.
We've spoken about the levels of delays. You mentioned the period 2 years prior to the pandemic a couple of times. Is that an unusual period? I mean, we're talking about prior to the pandemic. Was that an unusual period for somebody to be waiting?
No, not at all. Not if you take it from the report to the police to the case coming to court. It was very common that would be 18 months to 2 years.
And what effect has the pandemic had, or what effect did the pandemic have on those kind of waiting times, are you able to say?
It had a dramatic impact. Obviously, the court's been closed for a number of months, and then, I mean, they were restarted. July, I think it was July 2020, there was the first High Court trial, so it was a few months, there was no cases being heard at all. And then the numbers initially anyway were much lower in terms of the solemn cases that were like the jury cases that were going ahead. So that had a dramatic impact on the backlog, which then had a dramatic impact on the time that people were waiting for their case to get to court. And
again, anecdotally, what sort of time frames are we talking about?
Well, I mean, 3 years certainly wouldn't be uncommon. There was one woman that we supported who actually wanted to take a judicial review, but was refused permission, and who'd been waiting far longer than 3 years.
And you've mentioned those backlogs accruing during the pandemic. Have those now been resolved?
No, not at all. We're still supporting people who have been waiting significant periods of time for their case to reach court. There has been a significant expansion in pre-recorded evidence, which at least means that somebody can get their evidence over and done with, which I think does mitigate those issues to some degree, although obviously somebody still has the trial and the possible outcome of the trial hanging over them. But I think pre-recorded evidence really is a very, very positive development for those survivors that want that. I mean, there are some survivors I've spoken to where they feel strongly they want to give evidence in court. But for those where pre-recorded evidence is a positive development, I think it's really important that we're able to offer it and expand the facilities that we currently have. Ideally, we want it to be happening even sooner than it is now. Now it is sometimes still relatively close to the trial. I mean, I think the vision of the senior judiciary was that it would be happening much earlier than it is just now.
Okay. I'm going to move on from delays because I appreciate that's quite a big issue, and we could probably talk about that for some time. Before I do, is there anything else you wanted to mention about delays? And Ms Brindley, have we covered everything off on that?
I think so. I mean, it would be helpful maybe to say something about the attempts made to restart solemn proceedings. So I was involved in Lady Doreen, the Lord Justice Clerk, at the time set up a working group to look at restarting solemn trials. I think there was real leadership from the judiciary in this regard about looking at how do we in these very, very difficult circumstances, how do we possibly restart trials, jury trials, obviously raise significant issues because of the numbers involved. We have 15 people in a jury in Scotland. Those are significant numbers to consider in terms of social distancing. And I think the legal profession is to be lauded for the attempts they made to get to look creatively at how we restart criminal trials in these circumstances. So one of the key outcomes of Lady Doreen's group was remote trials in cinemas. And initially I was quite sceptical of this idea. I had real worries about how seriously it would be taken by jury members in a trial of such a serious and sensitive nature as a rape case, to be sitting in a cinema that you associate with popcorn and seeing films, how seriously jury members would take it. But they really quickly, the court service organised a visit to, I think it was Fort Kinnaird, one of the possible jury sites, and we could see what it would look like, and we were reassured that it could work, and it absolutely, the backlog would be so much worse if that hadn't happened. And I think the efforts of the judiciary, the Scottish Government in funding it, and the legal profession, including the defence bar, and their efforts to restart solemn trials, I think really should be noted. I mean, I would say that there was some mixed feedback from rape survivors in relation to trials being held in cinemas. We had one survivor who spoke to us, who said when she was given evidence she noticed a jury member had fallen asleep, and that was, I cannot see how distressing that was for her. We had other survivors where there wasn't a conviction, where they were really left with this haunting question of, if it hadn't been in a cinema, might it have been a different outcome? I mean, it's impossible to say. The conviction statistics seem like there wasn't a significant difference in convictions for trials held in cinemas. But I think it's just when you're in a crisis situation, which is what we were in, there is never a perfect, or there's rarely a perfect solution. I think it probably was the best that could be done in those circumstances. I think it was innovative, there was real leadership, but I think for some survivors maybe there were some questions about how seriously is what's happened to me being taken because it was being held in that kind of forum.
Do I understand from what you're saying, Ms Brindley, though, if you were to be suggesting or offering advice in the position that you are, if we were in the same situation again, would you be telling government that to proceed in some way is better than to wait, even if it's imperfect?
Yeah, on balance, absolutely. I dread to think where we would be now in terms of the backlog if those efforts hadn't been made to look at more creative solutions.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you now about the effect on survivors themselves. Could you explain to His Lordship what sort of effects, well, first of all, what sort of effects impact survivors in terms of sexual violence generally, and then perhaps, well, maybe address that first rather than me asking you two questions, excuse me.
Yeah, there was particular issues for survivors who were not safe at home. Many survivors of rape are being raped by their partner, their ex-partner, or someone that is living in their home. So that was a real worry about the pandemic, and the lockdown in particular was what it meant for women that weren't safe at home. How could they, as I spoke about earlier, how could they access support services? Their normal coping strategies were not available to them, so there was a really grave concern about safety. And I know my colleague from Scottish Women's Aid, who's speaking, giving evidence today, will speak more about that. I think in general terms, even if somebody was safe at home, just having the whole world shut down had a dramatic impact for rape survivors, just because of not being able to access their normal coping strategies, not being able to see their friends that maybe were the ones that they leaned on in terms of trying to come to terms with what they had been through. So it really had a very, very significant impact for survivors.
And how did that manifest? Was that reported to Rape Crisis?
Yes, well, survivors would phone us and just really talk about how difficult they were finding the lockdown, how much they were missing their normal coping strategies, but also talking about how important it was to have this outlet, to have our helpline, or to have the local rape crisis support available, so that at least there was one place where they could still speak about what they were going through.
What sort of effects? I mean, you've spoken obviously about psychological effects. What sort of effects were being reported in terms of that?
I mean, people reported feeling very, very anxious, maybe resorting to more negative coping strategies such as self-harming. People talked about feeling suicidal. I mean, it really was very profound impacts for survivors we were supporting.
you've mentioned there people feeling suicidal. Were there any incidences of people taking their own lives that you know of?
No, not that I'm aware of from our helpline.
You've spoken there about people normally leaning on their friends. In a rape or a sexual violence situation, or the aftermath, is it only the survivor that's affected by that?
No, friends and family members can be profoundly impacted as well. I think it's a very, very difficult thing to see somebody you love dealing with the aftermath of being raped. And that's why it's really important that our service is also available to friends and family members. So, for example, mothers phoning up just looking for support, or just talking through, like, how do I help my daughter when she's going through this. It is a very, very painful thing for family members, and it's really important that they have access to support and just information. Like, one of the most important things we can do for survivors, but also for parents and family members, is reassure them, look, what you're feeling is normal. There is no one right or wrong way to react to being raped. It's completely normal for your emotions to be all over the place. It's totally normal to have days where you just try and pretend it hasn't happened. And I think for survivors, that can be really important, that we can bring that knowledge and reassure them that this is a really normal way of responding to a really extraordinary event in your life. But also for parents and family members who maybe feel totally at sea, don't know what to do, don't know how to help the person they love, having access to that support and information can be really invaluable.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you now about the National Prevention Programme that you mentioned. Were there any changes to that during the pandemic?
I mean, again, profound changes. These are primarily sessions that we're doing with young people in schools. Schools closed down. What that meant was our prevention work just stopped overnight. Once schools reopened, obviously this was fluid, they reopened, they closed again. It was quite a stuttering start back for us, and there was a lot of variation across the country. So some schools did quite quickly facilitate online provision of prevention sessions with young people. Other schools, understandably in many ways, when you think about what it was like for education to cope with these circumstances, they didn't prioritise external agencies' input, and I think that is understandable. But what it did mean was that there was a dramatic decrease in young people being able to access the prevention workshops that we were running, and it took some time for us to re-establish them. I mean, we work with thousands and thousands of young people every year. We're now back to figures that are much higher than pre-pandemic, but during the pandemic, those figures just fell to the floor of the number of young people we were able to access in terms of our prevention work.
What kind of work is the prevention programme doing?
So we have a number of modules within the prevention programme. One of the most important ones is about consent. I cannot overstate how important this is, to be working with young people and equipping them with knowledge about what does the law say, what is rape, what does consent mean, and to provide a safe space for a non-judgmental safe space for young people to explore these issues. We're seeing ever-increasing numbers of reported rapes to the police, and we're seeing increasing numbers of young people, young men, being charged or being reported for rape. So I really cannot state enough how important I think this work is with young people. The external evaluation we commissioned of it confirmed that. Young people were saying, I don't have any other space where I'm getting this information or where I feel able to safely explore it. And this is something that we really need as young people. So that's one of the most important elements of our prevention programme, is the session we do with young people on consent.
The words in the title, I suppose, in terms of prevention and being the primary purpose of that programme, are there any other outcomes that come out of that programme in ordinary times?
I think sexual violence is very prevalent, but it is also often hidden, and often people don't feel, particularly young people, don't feel able to disclose what's happened or is happening to them. But I think there's something really powerful about naming sexual violence, making it speakable, that can then enable young people to speak out, to reach out and maybe speak to a teacher and say, actually, that happened to me. So I think just the very fact that you're in a school and you're saying sexual violence is something that happens, it's not uncommon, and here's some of the agencies that can help, I think that can have a really, really positive impact for young people. And it might not be something they're directly experiencing, it could be something they're seeing at home, that at least it gives them some information about this is something that you can talk about and there are people who will listen to you and take you seriously.
I'm conscious, Ms Brindley, that we have 5 minutes left of our time this morning. I'm just going to ask you one more question. And after that, I'm going to ask you whether there's anything else you want to raise before we finish our time. But just to give you a bit of notice of that, my final question just is in terms of engagement with the Scottish Government. I wonder if you could tell His Lordship whether you had and what engagement you had with Scottish Government through Rape Crisis.
Yeah, we had regular contact with the Scottish Government. One of the first things they did was make this fund available to ourselves in Scottish Women's Aid to adapt our services, and that was absolutely crucial. We would have really struggled to continue providing a service without that additional funding, and the fact it happened really quickly really was important for us. The Scottish Government then set up regular meetings with victims' organisations, so we had a channel of communication. I think, again, that was really important to have that structure in place where we could raise issues. For example, about key worker status was one ongoing issue for staff in rape crisis, issues around access to vaccines, issues around the justice process and court delays and communication. So we had the general contact with the Scottish Government. We also had the regular calls with the Lord Advocate and the Cabinet Secretary for Justice to raise specific justice issues. So I think those structures that were put in place were really important and welcome, and meant we had a channel where we could raise the issues that were coming up.
Was that a new channel? Was that a line of communication that was open already, or was that a new channel during the pandemic?
These were new structures that were set up specifically in relation to the pandemic.
And have those contacts and structures continued after the pandemic?
Those specific meetings don't continue now, but I would say we do have ongoing contact and relationships with the Scottish Government and with justice agencies such as the Crown and the Police and Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service.
Thank you. We do now just have a couple of minutes, Ms Brindley. As I say, we have your statement in full and the other documentation which you provided to the inquiry, and His Lordship will have an opportunity to take all of that into account in terms of the inquiry's reporting. But if there is anything that you particularly want to highlight to His Lordship, if there's any particular lessons that you consider he might wish to consider in terms of his reporting, now would be your opportunity.
I suppose one thing I would reflect on is that there's two major issues I've spoken about which weren't created by the pandemic, they were exacerbated by the pandemic, and that's funding for rape crisis services and it's funding or how the court service is organised in terms of delays. So the pandemic didn't create delays, the pandemic exacerbated existing delays. And I think we just cannot have survivors of such a serious crime as sexual offences of rape waiting such lengthy periods of time to give their evidence. So I suppose my reflection would be there are systemic issues there that underpin the difficulty we saw during the pandemic, and those systemic issues remain and require to be addressed.
Thank you. My Lord, I don't have any further questions unless your Lordship has anything to add.
No, thank you very much. Thank you, Ms Brindley. That's all, and we'll come back at 1:30.
All rise.